This episode was unintended, but I thought I'd cover my impressions on the Alliance Alive while they were still fresh in my mind. I just finished the game and had some thoughts on the writing. Apologies ahead of time for the inevitable incorrect pronunciation. I am limited by the text-to-speech software that I use. For the unaware, The Alliance Alive is a game about a ragtag crew of misfits coming from various places and walks of life, coming together due to circumstance, and looking into the origins of a phenomena called the Dark Current, along with the ancient magical technology that seems to be related to it. Along the way, there's some amusing character moments and dynamics, some exploration of the various parts of the world divided by the Dark Current, and your standard foiling of a villain's schemes. The Dark Current divides the setting into various worlds, with each of these worlds basically operating like a singular biome or environment. The division has been going on for a millennium, which means each area has had time to develop its own particular cultural quirks and practices. Along with environmental factors, it makes each one distinct. And there's also a race divide, with humans at the bottom, beast folk in the middle, and immortal demons at the top. In the process of looking into the Dark Current, our heroes eventually cause events that shatter this state of affairs and change the status quo while saving the world at the same time. As always, my concern here is not for the game mechanics or even the game as a whole, but the writing. Though I would like to point out that I enjoyed the game side of this just as much as the story. Sure, the game barely tells you how anything works, but if you are familiar with Square Enix and their Saga franchise, you'll grasp how things work easily enough. Anyway, let's dive into my thoughts on the story. One little detail I enjoy is how the world building of the game is handled. Some of it is explicit and presented as plot-relevant exposition, such as the origins of the Dark Current or the racial hierarchy between humans, beast folks, and demons. But in other instances, particularly the details that are less directly relevant to the story or moment at hand, it is presented in a different way. And the cast is structured such that there's usually one character or another that can be counted on to know the subject and thus provide exposition to both characters and players. In other times, the information is presented in a drip feed and in little snippets, sometimes requiring the player to infer or read between the lines to get all the information. The concept of things like ether gears, the nature of the powerful monsters called water devils, and even where demons and beast folk come from are all implied. There's nothing that states it outright, but if you look through the various in-game materials, you'll find them. Interestingly, this approach is taken for information that I'd consider good to know but not necessary to understand the plot. This second approach is actually one I'm fond of. It builds the world without smashing your face in with exposition or detail, but is instead there if you want to go looking for it or care enough to see the implications. This is something that I try to achieve when I write short stories, because there's really not enough room for several paragraphs detailing the history and culture of a place like you'd find in a novel or setting sourcebook for a tabletop game. What details you put in have to work seamlessly into the core narrative without adding unnecessary bulk, and I think this game handles it well within the format. Overall, the story of the game is neat but nothing spectacular. It isn't overly predictable, but it also doesn't have any particular standout moments or unexpected twists. In that sense, it's a little like the Super Mario Bros. Movie's story. It's safe, clean, and fun, but don't expect anything novel or risk-taking with it. One of the weaker points of the story, in my estimation, is the slow beginning. It is a little too slow, taking around 10 chapters to really get going. A part of this is that those early chapters are spent shifting perspectives to establish the core groups. We have Galil and Azura as the first group and arguably our main perspective, followed by Vivian and Ignace and Tiggy later on, and finally Jean and Rachel. While the narrative shifting perspectives does help establish how each piece of the main party puzzle came to be, I feel it stunts the beginning and makes the later, quicker pace of the narrative a bit jarring. Speaking of the cast, the characters do have some amusing interactions. Tiggy's growing attachment to the somewhat airhead Vivian and her constant verbal mistreatment of Ignace. Azura's perky, cheery demeanor being at least in part a cover to keep Galil from feeling any more guilty than he already does. the inability of anyone to figure out just what Jean really wants. These are others all decently written touches and add a layer of narrative to enjoy as you go through the plot, and it helps showcase the various personalities in place. I also love how the men in the party start out either laid back or reluctant to get into the plot early on. It's the ladies that take charge and keep the momentum going for most of the early game, before the plot really has the necessary stakes and weight to move things along of its own accord. Vivian, Tiggy, Azura, and to a lesser extent Rachel are the ones that push the narrative along and whose actions and decisions result in the party coming together and in getting things done, and I absolutely love this. The game isn't perfect in this regard, though. Azura and Vivian both have encounters with powerful endgame bosses in different points in the plot, which both leave them vulnerable. And these events are also used to add personal stakes to the party's motivation in the endgame. However, I think this damsel in distress issue is mitigated by them facing someone far beyond the whole party's capability to tackle, in situations where they were unprepared and with little in the way of backup. Also, they're never seen as less capable after the fact, except in one instance in the case of an overly convenient moment of physical frailty in Vivian's case. This does lead to a flaw in the writing. The characters don't have much in the way of arcs or growth. They have multiple traits and attempts at depth, such as revealing that the beast folk Barbarossa is actually quite handy at building things, or Tiggy clearly becoming more and more fond of her friendship with Vivian. But overall, none of them really display any character growth as they go through the game. They're rather flat, more of a collection of traits with personalities than fully rounded characters that grow as plot pushes forward. The only obvious exception to this is Ignace, Vivian's butler and right-hand daemon. He does have a sort of arc, in that he goes from being unable to understand what it is about humans that fascinates Vivian so much to valuing things like friendship, camaraderie, and loyalty the same way his human comrades do. That he spends the 2 instances of the party enjoying themselves getting drunk and dancing with Rachel helps sell the fact that he has grown to appreciate the mindset of the others around him, even if he might not immediately understand them. Note that just because the characters are fairly flat doesn't mean they're not enjoyable. There were moments where I couldn't help but smile at Vivian's airhead demeanor or the instances where Jean seems confused that no one is entirely sure what he's up to. Or Tiggy and her odd fondness for ducks, particularly since I don't think there are even any ducks native to the realm that she calls home. One final bit I'd like to mention that I enjoyed were some minor, easily skippable details at the very end. Once the final boss is defeated, there's one more party and the player has the opportunity to start talking to various important characters about the circumstances of their world. The game acknowledges the changes you've caused can also bring about potential problems, like mention that the warming climate means the snow realm is looking at a risk of disastrous flooding or that the millennium apart means that there will be drastic cultural difference between the various settlements. There's even a nod to the fact that it will take time to set up proper international shipping, which leads to a changing role for the Flying Dragon riders of one region from defenders to possible international couriers. This is something I've found is rarely ever addressed in games like this, and even in fantasy or science fiction novels that don't specifically focus on these kinds of knock-on effects. While the game doesn't dwell on these, it is nice to see the narrative acknowledge that the work isn't over even if the main objective has been completed. It gives a sense of the world going on after the events of the story without necessarily being a hook for a sequel. Overall, The Alliance Alive has a pleasing, if somewhat predictable, story. The characters, while flat and at times seem designed to be more functional than anything else, do have entertaining personalities and interactions. The story and such aren't going to wow anyone and there's not much depth to the characters, though it does a lot of things right. In the end, it does a lot of things right, but it doesn't do those right things enough times to really give the game narrative a sense of depth and roundness. Though I can't blame it too much for that. That's it for this surprise entry. I can't make any promises on when the next one will be, but I do intend to make another one. Probably about a book or story next time, just need to figure out which one. Until next time.